Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Dr. Mark Pettis, and with my friend, Dr. John Bagnulo. John, good morning, buddy.
Hey, good morning, Mark, and happy April.
Happy April 1st. Nice to be turning another month on the calendar. Here in New England, March can one day can feel like spring. The next brings you right back to winter. So there's something uplifting about April hitting the scene, and it's good to be getting here.
Yeah, and it's hard not to think about the sun. I mean, we don't get enough of it here in New Hampshire. I know you probably experience the same type of, 3 out of 4 days you get it's either really cold or really cloudy, and but hard not to be optimistic when it's April.
Hard not to be optimistic. And we talk a lot about light and health, John. It's been a recurring topic, in large part because it is so important, and in large part because it continues to be under-recognized, I think, by the the clinical community, as well as many people who continue to fear sunlight. And as the research continues to grow in a predictable way, I think you and I would say the obvious is being demonstrated in a lot of this emerging research. It's quite clear that we need to very fundamentally rethink our public health messaging with respect to our exposure to sunlight, what the true magnitude of those risks are, and as we'll look at today in this recent paper, what the true magnitude of the benefits are. And everything we do in life, right, John, is some assessment of risk benefit. Every choice we make will have a risk benefit proposition, a value proposition attached to it. And often our perception of risk and our perception of benefit can be influenced in ways that doesn't reflect where the truth is at. And I think whether we're talking about saturated fat, whether we're talking about red meat, protein, and certainly in the example of sunlight, there's been a lot of scrutiny, I think, with respect to where our messaging has been, and something that we know does not happen quickly, certainly in the medical industrial complex, is the ability to pivot quickly and adapt and change recommendations and perceptions and beliefs as a consequence of that emerging data. And I think that's an important message that we'll emphasize here today, John, is these are not nimble institutions. They're not designed by way of ego and the people who lead them. They're not designed in terms of the conflicts of interest, most of which are financial and prestige around publication. And many of them are not well aligned with what's in the best interest of the people that they serve. And so there are many layers to this conversation. And springtime is a good time to be reminded that we are designed to be outside. And the more we can leverage that, the better off we will be.
Yeah, the analogy that I use with this conversation that we'll have today is the French paradox. That is how researchers in nutritional epidemiology described the reduced all-cause mortality that was observed with the French population eating much more saturated fat in the early 1990s. It was looked at as this paradox, right? Because that was towards the height of the low-fat, low saturated fat mantra that not just the American Heart Association, but that most public health organizations, most physicians that's what was being delivered. And yet we had this, I just find it funny that it was called the French paradox, because you could have looked at other areas of the world where people are eating, more saturated fat and having a much lower risk of heart disease than we did here in the United States. But I think we're at the same place with respect to sunlight and all-cause mortality. Where whether you want to call it a paradox or I think you and I might call it common sense, but we can get to that in a little while. But the bottom line is, we have data and we have had data for a while that shows how if our goal is to have healthy life extension, right, and to have a reduced all-cause mortality, there's really no question that sunlight promotes both. And yet, we're going to call it a paradox, and let's just hope that it doesn't take as long as the fat. And even though there's still a lot of debate, by which you and I both think is ridiculous, there's debate around fat and saturated fat. It's kind of crazy. Let's just hope it doesn't take the institution, so to speak, to pivot, like you just described. I mean, if it takes 20 or 30 years for people to start acknowledging the benefits of sunlight and that cost benefit ratio that we're talking about, that would, wow, that would be stunning, right? If it takes us 20 or 30 years or 40 years like it has with saturated fat, that would be a real pessimistic view of the next 3 decades. But it's really clear, right? It's really clear that people who get the most sunlight, they live the longest. They have the lowest risk of chronic disease. And yet, why are they so entrenched? Is it money? Is it publication? What is it that keeps people so entrenched? I think that's the human psychology component of this that you and I often talk about, Mark.
There is a definite psychology to the choices we make, and that's a really interesting context as we think about how we choose, why we choose the way we do. I think once fear enters the analysis, once your amygdala, your fight flight button is activated, your ability to see shades of gray becomes undermined, and so something is either good or it isn't. And I'm always intrigued, John, by the extent to which fear underlies whether it's fat, whether it's red meat, whether it's sunlight, whether it's maybe being out in nature more, whether it's fear of what will happen if I leave this job that I hate, or end this relationship that's ruining my life.
Yeah.
I'm always mindful when I'm contemplating my own journey, my own self-care, and that's where all the work really is, right? What's on our plate, of how recognizing fear as an important instinct, if you will. It's protected us and saved us on many levels, but in modern life, it becomes so pervasive that even when the objective information that you are attempting to assess from a risk-benefit standpoint exists, your ability to accurately make that assessment will be compromised, and which is why people fear flying more than they fear driving, right? Even though the death rate driving cross country will be much higher, an order or two of magnitude higher than what it would be to fly cross country. And yet,
fear's like inflammation. You need a short, quick dose of it to keep you away from, an animal that has, big teeth and an aggressive attitude. You need to have those short windows of fear because those do keep us safe at times, but it's the chronic fear that keeps us in prison. And I think that's the fear that, that I see you describing, that is, and it's so pervasive. People are afraid of, so many things that are just unfounded.
Absolutely, and it's a superb way to control the masses. We there are no shortage of historical examples where the playbook is make people as fearful as you can, get people to hate each other as much as you can, And while they're fighting each other and hating each other and completely paralyzed with fear, we'll go on and do what we need to do.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah,
and,
that is the playbook.
it's easy to sort of give away your sovereignty without realizing that you're giving it away. That's what's so dastardly about that playbook. And anyhow, let's that's a good segue, John. I'll bring up the paper here. And this is what's called a pre-publication. This will soon be published, and this was available for review. And this is a paper from the UK, and we've had a few recent conversations about research done through the UK Biobank.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
And that this study will come from that same cohort as well. And the title of this, Risk-Benefit Balance of Habitual Ultraviolet Exposure, another way of saying sunlight exposure, for cardiovascular, cancer, and skin cancer mortality. And so they're setting us up now with what will be a data that will allow, I think, a more objective and quantifiable magnitude of risk and benefit. And the data is pretty stunning.
Yeah.
And so what the study did, John, they looked at 419,000 adults. So this was England, Scotland, Wales. So these were predominantly Caucasian. So 419,000. And they looked at their sunlight exposure. And they used this tool that's demonstrated on this slide here, called the Sun Behavioral Environmental Exposure Model. These are validated tools that have been researched that look at not only how much time a person spends outside, but it looks at other environmental factors, from light use indoors to residential exposure, how much protection they use when they're outdoors. And it's a multi-dimensional tool that allowed the researchers to stratify what ultimately, as one can see here, low UV exposure. These would be people that spend very little time outside. And when they are outside, they're covered from head to toe. They lather up with sunscreen, sunblock, and most people that fall into this category very much fear sunlight. Then there's this intermediate group based on their responses to this survey tool. And then there was the high group, and these were people often that worked outdoors, that spent more time outdoors, that used less rigorous and aggressive protection when outdoors. And so they had a very large cohort, right? Over 400,000. And they were able to use this tool to stratify. And this is just a brief overview of the cohort. And it's about 46% essentially had low UV exposure. This was about 91,000 people of that cohort. About 83,000 fell into the medium category. And not surprisingly, fewer people were getting a lot of sun in this UK Biobank cohort. But still, they're over 19,000. And these were statistically significant. So people, one might conclude that people in general in the UK were adhering to the guidelines. Very few people were getting what this assessment tool would have rated as high exposure. And we'll come back to the conclusions in a moment, John. But that was the design of the study. And then they measured in their biobank how many people died of skin cancer, of melanoma as a sort of a subcategory of skin cancer. And then they looked at mortality from heart disease, cardiovascular disease, which continues to be the greatest cause of death in the Western world. Cancer mortality, a very close second now. So they looked at the all-cause mortality, specific cardiovascular cancer, and skin cancer mortality over the several years that these people were monitored, John. So it was pretty, it's an observational cohort, and pretty good N in terms of large numbers of people, and some pretty compelling results that we'll look at in a moment. But I'll pause here and let you just weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think there's a few things right off the top. Like number one is 46% were considered low. To your point, they're adhering to the guidelines, right? They're lathering up, they're really minimizing their time out in the sun, avoiding the sun, you would say. And so you got just under half of this really large sample size you would categorize as low to no UV exposure. That's stunning.
Yes.
Half of a population, because I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that this sample size would probably, given the number of participants involved here, you're getting a really good representation of the UK overall. And I would bet, Mark, that you're going to find the same thing in the US here, right? So you're going to get about half of a population. Let's just call them a Western, whether Western industrial, whatever, however we want to describe these modern industrialized, populations. You get half of our population is avoiding the sun or doing everything they can to protect themselves from it. I mean, just those numbers, that's powerful. That's just a powerful number to consider.
Absolutely. Right? And certainly, one could make the case that, right, when you look at the environment, right, the UK is at a more northern latitude, so this is certainly not
you have very few.
Where you're going to get lots of natural light anyway, and we do.
I didn't know that you could burn. I honestly didn't know you could burn in the UK. All joking aside, I mean, it's up there, right, in terms of the latitude. It's not a sunny climate. So that part alone is fascinating.
Skin that that go out on a sunny day, but yeah, right. So, but I think you're totally right, John, that this would not be at all unusual for the general population in many Western countries, and even though we know, not to digress, but we know that so many chronic complex diseases have lower incidence and prevalence at more southern latitudes. Even at those southern latitudes now, so many people protect themselves, so they're not getting exposed, even though they live in places rich and abundant with the opportunity to get more exposure, because they, I'm often intrigued by Michael Hollick's research at Boston University, where even in places like Phoenix, you'll see generally low vitamin D levels. And it's simply because, they live in these incredibly sun-rich places, but they adhere. They're very mindful of the public health messaging. And so much as people were with low fat and eating so many of that poor quality, low fat food, people do heed the call. And then we see the public health ramifications. So where people are less healthy than ever, and not only dying younger, but having poor quality of life along the way. So when we look at, so that was the cohort, and that was the tool, the methodology. Let me just pull up some conclusions around the results here, John. There we go. Sorry about that. So this is just a high-level conclusion. And what they found, I'll just read this and then I'll pause, John, and you can comment. So higher habitual ultraviolet exposure. So this was in that the intermediate and then that higher group that we looked at using a multidimensional score. That was this Sunbeam score, was associated with lower cardiovascular and non-skin cancer mortality, with clear increases in skin cancer mortality without clear increases. That's a big difference. Without clear increases in skin cancer mortality, supporting what should be a more balanced view of sunlight and health. So decreases in all-cause mortality across the board without seeing statistically significant increases in skin cancer mortality, namely melanoma, which in my experience, John, is generally the most fearful reason a person will give you about wanting to avoid sunlight. They
Absolutely.
skin cancer
Yeah.
and especially melanoma. So this
Yeah.
data suggested tremendous benefit with higher exposure, tremendous risk with lower exposure, and no real difference in skin cancer mortality. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So, we know that public health advice, right, treats sunlight as a skin cancer hazard. Few studies have explicitly quantified, as this study attempted to do, the trade-off between potential benefits of habitual ultraviolet light exposure for major non-skin diseases and its harms for skin cancer. And this was an important point, John. The mechanistic research on how ultraviolet exposure affects health has focused largely on vitamin D. Most people, I think, would tout vitamin D as the reason to get more sun. What these researchers did is they had blood work on over 40,000 participants, and they were able to look at what's called proteomics. So they were able to measure proteins, these biomarkers, in both the low sun exposure, intermediate, and high sun exposure cohorts. And they looked at measures of inflammation. They looked at measures of neuroendocrine, we might call that glycemic control. They looked at, sort of antioxidant capacity. And aside from vitamin D, all of these major metabolic pathways were activated with more sunlight. So you could easily say that the findings they demonstrated weren't specifically vitamin D related, and I think we've so oversimplified this story, right, John? That
absolutely.
Vitamin D is the issue, and it's an important issue. We talk about this all the time. But sun has so many non-vitamin D related health biologic effects. So we have mechanisms at many levels that would support protection against cancer, protection against cardiovascular disease. And that aligns perfectly with what this prospective observational cohort is showing.
Yeah, it is amazing that people somehow still feel that taking a vitamin D supplement is the equivalent to sunshine. Again, that's that reductionistic mindset that we, as a species, we often fall into, that trap. I can just take a pill. I can just take a capsule of whatever it is that's the rate limiting factor. But, I just think people have no idea or appreciation by and large. I mean, obviously many of probably our listeners do from the exposure that we've given them to this topic. But, for the average person, they don't understand the role that sunlight has in terms of our hemodynamics, right? The ability to form a clot, or the resistance to forming clots prematurely, how much heparan sulfate really helps regulate that and how we generate heparin sulfate when we get full spectrum sunlight. Nitric oxide mobilization. I mean, these things really start to speak to the reduction in cardiovascular disease that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years with more UV exposure, right? I mean, you can go back to 1990 and find papers, with Swedish women, for let's say, that have less breast cancer, but, really marked reductions in cardiovascular disease with more sunburns, not just UV exposure, but actually burning. And, again, it doesn't have to be that extreme. We're not suggesting people need to burn, but there is now, again, go back 36 years, we have papers that show it's much, much more about how the sun affects components of blood chemistry than it is vitamin D. And again, it's remarkable that people think, well, I don't go out in the sun. I had a cousin that had malignant melanoma. My husband's sister had malignant melanoma. Again, the fear that you spoke to earlier, it's largely around melanoma, but there isn't any data to support that sunlight increases our risk for malignant melanoma. But that's the mindset that most people are in, that it's axiomatic for these people. If I go out in the sun, I'm at a greater risk of melanoma. That's where a lot of this fear comes from. And again, I think that's a big piece of this study. And I really value this study, not just because of the sample size and how well respected the UK Biobank is. I mean, this should really, for the most entrenched dermatologists, for the, for the people that have just been so close-minded with respect to this messaging about more sun is better, this should really open eyes. It should. It's not to say it's new data, but it's the way the study is designed and the very large sample size. I mean, a couple 100,000. This is significant data. But it really is I think the culmination now of 30, 40 years of prior studies that were a little smaller, maybe a little more, myopic in terms of what they were looking for, but they showed the same thing. This is just really put together in an amazing way.
Yeah, and you really do, as we've talked about prior, you see the extent to which fear mongering
Yeah.
really seems to undermine what might be good intentions in public health recommendations and the recommendations of these respected specialty groups like the Heart Association, the Diabetes Association, and it's it says a lot about our need to step back, how we educate the public, how we frame our conversations. Because it is striking how not just studies from 30, 35 years ago were raising some red flags. Generations of human beings before us would have laughed at you had you told them, stay in your hut, stay in your cave. They would have laughed at you if you said, don't eat those eggs. That red meat you're about to consume, we've lost. These are modern. I guess the point that I'm trying to make, John, these are contemporary phenomenon. These are phenomenon of systems that I think have become resistant in their ability to take rapidly emerging knowledge and translate it in a way that is free of conflict and ego, and which is why the health edge exists, right? It's just empowering people to discern, and most will feel better when they're in the sun. Yes, picking your time of day, earlier morning, later afternoon, early evening is wise. But that's very different than not getting any unprotected light, right? And so we don't seem to be able, as a species, to learn well from history, from
basic biology.
Yes.
Right? Or from basic biology. We just, for whatever reason, we put all of that foundational science aside, right? And follow public health messaging that is not grounded in biology.
Yeah, exactly, John. Anthropology, there are so many disciplines
Right.
that should be impacting our global knowledge of the topics we're attempting to address, and yet you don't see that. I don't hear many dermatologists presenting an anthropologic perspective on sunlight risk and benefit. Same with your cardiologist and your endocrinologist, and there is we'll just share a few more slides here, John. Right, there is this rich sort of history, and again, this is just from Dr. Martin Moore-Eade, kind of a summary of this study as well. For every malignant skin cancer fatality saved by staying indoors, 75 deaths from other causes occur because of lack of exposure to the healing power of natural daylight. Now, let that sink in, right, for a second. For every extra malignant skin cancer fatality caused by increased UV exposure, there would be 134 lives saved from all other causes of death, including heart attacks and non-skin cancers, breast, prostate, colorectal cancer. This is a huge issue, right, John?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Medical oncologists, dermatologists, medical oncologists, really, sunlight equals skin cancer risk, and that's where it ends. That's where the assessment ends, and without recognizing that the best thing for people confronting cancer diagnoses, risk, or treatment in general would be to be getting more sensible, we'll call it sensible sunlight. You don't
Sure.
need to go out midday and bake to realize these effects. And so this study is still in peer review. I do want to emphasize that, but will be published soon. And we just wanted to give our Health Edge tribe, our community, kind of a sneak preview. But this data would suggest about a 1 to 100 ratio between deaths caused by UV exposure and death saved by UV exposure. That is a stunning statistic that should take any clinician or any individual who's sort of uncertain about this value proposition and give pause.
Yeah, it's stunning is the only way to describe it. And everybody really values cost benefit ratios, risk reward, an approach to things. And I don't think it could be any clearer. And then what I always say is, we'll stay on this topic, but the synergy between some of these different components of lifestyle, right? I mean, how much more does that 100 to 1 ratio become magnified when you start to add some of the other inputs to this? The type of fat. We know that a diet higher in polyunsaturated fat, for instance, will increase the potential for sun to damage the skin, right? So you'd probably end up with a ratio that would be much higher than 100 to 1, right? When you start to factor in some of those other components, environmental, diet, sunlight, is it is there's an interface between that UV exposure and different facets of our biology, and the type of fat, for instance, is huge. So there's all those relationships that I think could make this an even more powerful ratio. But again, I don't want to digress into
That's
those.
such a great point, John. Thank you. Yeah, right. If you're getting that sun exposure while outdoors moving, while
Yeah,
outdoors, maybe with your pet, right, or a
yeah,
friend, someone you love and have fun with, having that wonderful bond and connection while moving in an outdoor
right.
environment, or growing your vegetables and going outdoors, gardening, and or just getting out to the farmer's market and looking at those foods that being out under sunlight and getting water and our soil and the microbes that you see how this ecosystem rewards you uh, when the feedback is amazing, when the input or the feed forward is aligned in a way that can best leverage that. Um, and there, as we always talk about, 1+1 = 5, right? This is not
Exactly. Yeah.
linear. We're talking about
The
orders of
most human.
magnitude.
Yeah, these are the most human experiences we can incorporate into our life.
Yeah.
Really.
And as we've I always find it interesting, John. As you know, this is a topic that I do think about a lot, and I just had a few slides from other talks I've given on this topic. How right we think a paper in 2026 is pretty compelling and pretty amazing, particularly when it challenges conventional wisdom. But smart people have been aware of these connections. And I love this for those that like sort of ancient history. This is heliotherapy was perhaps one of the more widely prescribed interventions back in Hippocrates' day. Many of the ancient healers and philosophers just understood
Yeah.
the benefit of that. And ancient Olympians would practice outside.
Yeah.
Scantily clothed, right? They knew they could enhance their training and their performance, that they would be stronger, that their bones would be stronger, their muscles would be stronger. They took sun baths, and they would not have looked kindly upon your recommending that they go back inside. And then, it was really just to turn the clock ahead a bit, John, because we forget history. I was never taught any of this in med school or residency fellowship training. But at the turn of the 20th century, now, 125 years ago, this is Niels Ryberg-Finsen. He won the Nobel Prize for his discovery, his recognition that sunlight, and in particular ultraviolet light, though less was understood about the specific frequencies within full spectrum light and non-visible light. But back when TB was such a devastating infection, he found that light exposure could help heal tuberculosis. Yeah. And the results were quite phenomenal. And at that time, nothing had been demonstrated to impact that, which was killing so many kids and adults. So he was given the Nobel Prize. And soon thereafter, you see this implementation of these lamps of hope, as they were called, the Finsen lamp. You couldn't be in a hospital anywhere in Western Europe the turn of the 20th century where you weren't starting to see more light lamps and therapeutic lamps in clinical settings. They knew this seemed to have effect on the microbial community. It had antibiotic effects. This is long before the discovery of penicillin. They knew that the ultraviolet end of the spectrum seemed to be uniquely effective for tuberculosis and other skin and wound infections. And this sort of became the standard of care.
Yeah.
And back when many people were hospitalized for TB, this was part of the playbook. You were brought outside.
Yeah.
Imagine this being a hospital in 2026, John. You'd never see this.
Yeah, no.
You'd never see this. If you dropped into hospital St. Elsewhere today, and you were a reviewer for Medicare, and you saw that the patients in this particular hospital were all outside like this, you would be condemned. Yeah. You would be fined. You would be penalized. You would confront loss of accreditation to treat Medicare patients, and it's kind of stunning when you look back.
Really is.
You see that people just understood that this was a good thing to be doing. Today, right? I'm making the point, right? This was a
Yeah.
really interesting book for those that like the history. This was published in 1910 by J.H. Kellogg. This is the Kellogg of Battle Creek,
Yeah. You're
uh,
right.
who was a physician. Many people didn't know that Kellogg was a physician, and this is a manual you can find online. It's like 100 pages. It's free. It's a PDF, and it's fascinating to look at the time what was a very sophisticated understanding and interest in the therapeutic effect of light. And of course, heliotherapy became a very much recognized standard of care
Yeah.
for all kinds of skin and health related issues. And as we've talked about before, John, this is a slide worth resharing. Is we talk about the non-vitamin D related effects of light, both visible and non-visible light. And again, as you pointed out, nitric oxide, which is critical for cardiovascular health, is stimulated in the skin to a great extent by ultraviolet A light. Everyone is aware of vitamin D, but that's really not the story here. We just looked at some of the antimicrobial effects of ultraviolet light.
Mm.
Then you get into the blue range, and you see the effect on bilirubin. Kids that are jaundiced go home with these blue blankets that helps the liver
Yeah.
eliminate. We talk about circadian health. These frequencies of light, particularly 480, turn our clocks on. We want this early in the day. This is that
Mm.
sunrise within a few hours of sunrise. Man, it is the perfect environmental prescription for how to start one's day. And of course, without sunlight, there are no plants. Um, I mean, that alone, for anyone who sees the sun as a risky proposition, I don't know how you can reconcile what has been generations of research just supporting so many
Yeah.
benefits, wound healing.
Mark, you could overlay mitochondrial resuscitation on over that photosynthesis. What we have learned over the last 30 or 40 years about the similarities between photoblasts and mitochondria and the benefits that light provides both. It's remarkable.
It is remarkable, and that's a great. You look at collagen production, nitric
Yeah.
oxide, sulfation, and then mitochondrial support. Just to your point, John, these are much of the impact here has focused on the red 680 nanometer and the near infrared. And it is so complementary to what you see in plants of photosynthesis that take light and water and they produce mass. Plants convert energy into mass. That's pretty miraculous.
Really is.
We will take the mass in our mitochondria and convert it to energy. And
Right.
how beautiful! I mean, if that doesn't bring you to your knees,
Exactly.
I don't know what would.
Exactly.
And we have visited this topic in the past. We can come back to it at some point, John. But this water will change its molecular structure when exposed to red, near infrared wavelengths of light, what's called exclusion zone water, and biologic water in a human being, in an organism, seems to favor this pattern. Water is not water is not water, and the effect of light
So
on.
again, Mark, basic biology, right? Cytoplasm. Everybody understands it and appreciates it, but there's this loss of this loss of appreciation, I would say, for how sunlight helps us maintain that fourth phase of water, which we call cytoplasm.
Exactly. And this, as we bring this home, John, to come back
This is
to,
great. Yeah.
you this is research. It's 30 years old now,
Yeah.
looking at heart disease mortality and sunlight exposure. This is Scandinavian data. And again, these are correlations. This is epidemiologic observational data. We acknowledge that, but we've given you many mechanisms that would explain these observations. And you just see dramatic inverse relationships between, these would be people who would have been in that high UV exposure category in the biobank data. These would be people that had lower exposure. And you see these dramatic inverse relationships in this example with cardiovascular mortality. And again, there have been many papers along the way from researchers that have challenged this thinking. We've talked about Michael Hollick, whose research I would highly recommend. And this also an interesting, same Scandinavian group, John, a bit more recent. And what I loved about this was more research looking to quantify the effects. So they looked at all-cause mortality in almost 30,000 women in relationship to sun exposure. This was a 20-year follow-up. Women with active sun exposure habits were mainly at a lower risk of cardiovascular disease and non-cancer, non-cardiovascular death as compared to those who avoided sun exposure. And again, consistent. This is right, very consistent data. And these graphs are very revealing when you look at the blue here are those that avoided the sun. The red, again, intermediate, and then the green had the most sun exposure. And in non-smokers, you see reductions in cardiovascular risk, slight reductions in cancer, and other mortality causes. And then if you look at smokers, you see an even greater impact. It's almost like sun exposure negated the effect of smoking. And that's a very powerful magnitude of effect across the board. And again, so, we've gone from this tendency to sort of worship the sun to complete
heliophobia. That's great.
Where, this is a species with amnesia here. And again, I would close with this slide. I like this word Zeitgeber.
Yeah.
This German a cue given by the environment, such as a change in light or temperature, to reset one's internal, biologic clock. And we talk a lot about circadian biology, but today we just get too little of these things, including incandescent lights, which are now banned because of their energy consumption. Not enough time around the campfire. And so we've replaced these ancestral ways of life with just lots of time indoors under fluorescent lighting, right in front of our devices, around these lower energy consuming lights that offer very little bandwidth as far as light spectral quality. At night, we're just, and then we're dousing ourselves with sunblocks, which are important, but many of them have toxins in them, endocrine disruptive agents in them. There's an importance of sunblock. There's an importance of avoiding peak sun to its extreme day after day. But these are the Zeitgebers. Go outdoors, move, right? To your point, John, it's an amplification effect, social interaction, love, right? Winding down. And this is the roadmap that thousands of generations before us were very familiar with and endowed us with. This was from a paper that I think you may have brought to my attention a few years back, John, the concept of paleo deficit disorder. We've lost that paleo playbook, and today we could have the best of both worlds, but we've abandoned so much of that wisdom for modern conveniences that are awesome, but if not maybe integrated in a more thoughtful way, will disrupt your health at every level.
Yeah, and I hope that, for some of our listeners, and I always say this to different people that I work with or have as a client, it's funny, a lot of people out there will follow a paleo diet, right? Because they understand that the foods they're eating are much more in line with what our ancestors would have eaten, and our biology, really resonates with that. Um, I know people that will go to the Hippocrates Institute or the former Hippocrates Institute, right? And they'll eat the prescribed diet there because that's what Hippocrates, in essence recommended. But in both of these kind of like mindsets, I've met people that follow a paleo diet and they won't go out in the sun. I've met people that you go to Hippocrates and, totally avoid the sun. And it's funny because like, how could you choose one without acknowledgement of how Hippocrates also recommended, heliotherapy, and how our Paleolithic ancestors at that time were out in the sun for, 7 or 8 hours a day. It's like, I think just that's again speaks to the psychological component to this, which is we pick and choose sometimes what we want to hear, what we want to listen to. But I really love this presentation. I can't thank you enough, Mark, man. It's some of those slides were really powerful. The study that you led in with is remarkable. To think you got 300,000 people that you're looking at from the UK Biobank. The numbers that come out of that are so powerful, right? It's just on every level. And then I love the way you concluded it there with just what a basic human requirement this is and has always been, and how much evidence has been out there going back to, early 1900s, whether it's with TB, right? Whether it's with rickets, and then even the psychological mental health benefit of heliotherapy. That's been known for, 100 plus years as well. We just don't do well when one of those core requirements to human physiology, one of those most basic necessities for us to feel good, to think well, to function like our biology is meant to, you can't run from the cure, as we like to say.
Well, that is a great way to bring this home, John. Thank you for that, and thank you for listening to the Health Edge. We will have the video and some of the slides that we shared as always, and some of the open source references that we've shared with you as well. And if nothing more, just rethink what you think is serving you well, and how perhaps you can modify those beliefs. Ultimately, your beliefs will lead to your behaviors, and it's helpful to take inventory of those beliefs. And the spring is just a good time to take inventory, particularly with respect to one's perceived fear of light, one's perceived benefit of light, and hopefully today's review will inspire people to do that, John. So I know you and I will be outdoors whenever we can, and look forward to connecting again next week, John. It's always a pleasure being with you, and sending you and your family love and lots of light.
Same to you, brother. Love you. Thank
Love
you.
you as well. Take care.